Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, our tour guide for things historical in British Columbia. We've gone to the Yukon, to Alberta, to northern United States, and today we're heading to southeastern part of British Columbia. That's either coal or silver country.
Yeah, that's right, Mike. We're heading into the silver country, and we're hitting into that kind of that area around Cranbrook and Kimberley, but a little south of those two towns, in a little place called Moyie. And it's kind of interesting because in the 1890s, the early 1890s, there was all sorts of attention drawn to that particular area. The focus of mining was on it because they'd made two magnificent discoveries. One would later turn out to be the most legendary silver mine in the world, surpassed Broken Hill in Australia, and this was the famous Sullivan Mine, discovered by a guy called Pat Sullivan, who was one of 10 Irish miners in a group that came into that country. And the strange thing about it was that he had a recurring dream. He dreamt consistently, year after year, that he would eventually die in a cave-in. And he discovered the Sullivan Mine, which was named after him, went down into Idaho, and did die in a cave-in. And the interesting thing was, the Sullivan eventually, of course, became a magnificent mine, literally a mountain of silver ore, and his partners, who were paid only $10,000 for this, made sure he got his $1,000 share, and it went to his heirs in Ireland.
They made sure that it got over there.
Yeah.
Boy, it's just $1,000 for the biggest silver producer in the world. Seems like small pittance, isn't it?
Produced hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But he wasn't the only guy in there. Yeah. There was a guy called Joe Bourgeois, whom we've alluded to in Rossland. Mm-hmm. He was there in the discovery of Red Mountain. He was there on the Bull River when they discovered the placers there. And later, he eventually came in and discovered a magnificent mine called the North Star, which was close to Kimberley. And this, again, focused attention on this area. But not all the guys who were interested in mining were prospectors. There were other people interested in mining, and one of these was a very interesting Roman Catholic priest, a guy called Father Nicholas Cocola, and he came into that country with a far different vision of mining than the average prospector.
So it's his story and his association with other silver in the area we're going to talk about today. We'll be back in just a second as Gold Trails and Ghost Towns continues with a look into southeastern British Columbia and a silver-oriented priest. Don't go away. Gold Trails and Ghost Towns, Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, talking about southeastern British Columbia, not Kimberley, not Cranbrook, not the Sullivan Mine, but someplace that was really stimulated by this Father Nicholas Cocola.
Yeah, Father Cocola was an interesting guy, and he was quite ambitious as far as the church was concerned. He had a long history as a missionary, and his first mission was in St. Eugene, which is on the Tobacco Plains. And he had a kind of an...
This is in that area?
That was in the area, in the southern part of the East Kootenay, right near the Montana border. And so he had a kind of an interesting congregation, and amongst the congregation were some individuals who hadn't liked him when he first came there, because he was a very high-powered individual. And one of these guys was a guy called Pierre, who later comes into this story rather importantly. And anyway, he was speaking to his congregation and talking in church, of course, giving a sermon. And finally, at the end of it, he said, "We need a church. And I believe that this," and he held up a piece of ore, which was galena, which they called chickaman stone. And he said, "If any of you find chickaman stone in the hills when you're out riding or out hunting," he said, "please bring it back to me." He said, "then we may be able to build our church." And so the Indians examined this chickaman stone, and a few weeks later, who came back with several pieces of chickaman stone but Indian Peter, or Indian Pierre. And they were very, very rich, and he had gone out into the hills and discovered this chickaman stone. So Father Cocola had good connections, too. He knew another guy called James Cronin, who was actually a multimillionaire from Spokane. He was an entrepreneur, a mine owner, and his brother was a railroad magnate, and they were very well connected indeed. Very interesting family.
It's important who you know, even if you're a priest, eh?
Sure, and of course Cronin was an Irish Catholic as well, you see, so this is interesting. So he got together with Cronin, and together with Indian Peter, they rode out to the south of Cranbrook and Kimberley, and came across a little lake. And Peter went to the east side of this lake, and he went up in the hills on the east side, and there they saw a 4-foot vein of practically solid galena. Spectacular. And of course, Cronin, being a very well-versed mining man, examined the galena and noticed that it was small cubed and that it was high in silver ore. So they made a deal on the spot. They staked 2 claims, the St. Eugene and the St. Peter, you know, being good Roman Catholics, of course. And these were the keys to a magnificent mine. And the result was that Father Cocola received $12,000 on his behalf and on Peter's behalf. He built his mission church. And, of course, he gave the remainder to Peter, or Pierre, and Pierre had a brand-new house built for him. But the interesting thing about Pierre was that Father Cocola was very happy with the church, but after a while, Pierre evidently was not happy with the house. So he chopped a hole in the roof of the house, and he erected a teepee inside. So he would be shielded from the winds, but still have his teepee, which he was used to living in.
That was good enough. Well, that's a wonderful story, but was that good enough for Cocola? Did he? That's as much as he wanted. He wasn't. He didn't want to benefit from the riches of this mine beyond that.
Well, I mean, you may say that he got the shaft and Cronin got the silver. That's true, but I don't think that's necessarily true. He was happy. He'd made a deal on the spot, and of course he should have cut himself in for a small percentage of the ore that came out of this magnificent mine, which ultimately became, for many years, the premier silver mine in British Columbia. And eventually, of course, when the Sullivan came into great production, it surpassed the St. Eugene.
So they might have both occurred at about the same time, but initially it was the St. Eugene that was the most productive, or the richest,
yes.
earliest?
First the North Star, then the St. Eugene, and then the Sullivan.
Oh, it's all there, isn't it?
And, yeah.
The priest was happy. Did the Indians feel happier about this now, too? I mean,
well, in retrospect, it's hard to tell. Most of them were illiterate at that time, so we haven't any records to see how the Indians actually felt. But I imagine that Peter was quite acceptable. He was an individual who tended to roam through the Kootenai country, and having a spot to go back to was probably fine for him.
There's got to be a town that springs up around a mine as rich as this. What are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about a town called Moyie, and it's sprung up around the. And there's an example of the, and that's how it's spelled, M-O-Y-I-E. And here's a CPR line going right into the mine itself. The mine was so rich that they had to build a lay track right into the mine itself. And the mine, of course, was the St. Eugene, and one of the legendary mines of southern British Columbia.
Fair town.
And the town itself.
Is that Lake Moyie in the background?
Yes, that's Moyie Lake in the background. And the town approached almost 1,000, between 800 and 900 population at its height. And the town was kind of a fascinating town because it celebrated 2 major holidays. One was the 1st of July, and one was the 4th of July. And this is a hose reel race on the 1st of July in Old Moyie. And you'll notice in this shot, Mike, that there are literally hundreds of people lining the streets as the winners come down the street. And usually they ran 100 yards pulling the hose reel behind them. And the hose reel, of course, was a fire machine, one of the earliest of the fire machines.
July 1st being a Canadian holiday, a Dominion holiday, I guess, in this case. But that must have been one heck of a long weekend, because the Americans had theirs just a few days later.
Yes, they did. So it was. Usually they rolled it right, and it was a long, hectic weekend. And, of course, some of the hotels, so this town had about 3 or 4 hotels, and some of these hotels were really quite magnificent. Here's the Kootenai Hotel, and you see the date up top, 1898, and some of the inhabitants close by, and some of the people who lived in the hotel. And, of course, the Kootenai Hotel, like most of the mining towns, had a room in the hotel where the miners and the mine owners and the professional gamblers, the tin horns, would engage in poker games. And the result was, of course, that a great deal of money would change hands.
You have a bag here that must have 10 pounds of poker chips in it. Are these necessarily all from this country, or some of them?
They're from the Kootenai boundary country, so they're kind of a mix. But this would be the type of poker chip they would use, what we'd call a stock poker chip. Yeah. And they come in red, white, and blue. And of course, the blue is the most valued chip.
That's the $100. This is the
maybe $25, maybe $5. And they may be 25 cents, $1, and $5, whatever the house put on them. And, of course, you can see some of these poker chips, they have with little burns on them. That's where they put the actual...
cigarettes?
Put the cigarettes down.
Yeah,
and you can see, on the white ones especially, Mike, you'll find that some of the ones on the white cigarette burns are quite obvious. And so they just lay their cigarette on that. And, of course, usually they dealt in chips, but not always. Sometimes they went back to the real metal of the time, and these are 1890s silver dollars, or cartwheels, as they were called.
Nice ring to them,
Well,
you know?
sure, and a lot of the miners understood this, because they were American miners who came into the Moyie country and into Moyie town to make their fortune and look through the town and try to find another St. Eugene.
So in a pinch, a silver dollar was as good as a chip, you know, if you just sort of run out of chips and you had a couple
you
of
could
these.
reach into your pocket and actually takes cash out of your pocket.
They really feel nice, don't
Oh,
they?
yeah, sure they do.
The only thing better, I guess, is gold. There's a
Yes,
little of that in the neighborhood, too. This is a
Yes.
wonderful cane.
Yeah, isn't it? That's really quite remarkable. It's a bone handle, and the cane itself has 18-karat gold at the top and sterling silver part way down. And this would be typical of a dandy of the time, probably an entrepreneur, perhaps a mine owner, and perhaps a tin horn gambler, Mike.
There's an initial, WF, right on the neck of it here. Have you ever traced this down?
Either
to the
WF or WT, and it's hard to tell, and I can't trace it down, Mike. I'd like to. It's late 1890s, early 1900, and that's all I can tell. And but it was typical of the time. This would be...
I feel almost aristocratic just waving it around, you know. This is something else.
Yeah, it's quite unique.
So this was a bustling place.
Oh,
If you
yeah.
didn't make the money in the mines, you could win it in the poker game.
Sure.
You could
Sure.
carrying right on.
Oh, yeah, it was one of the typical mining towns of the East Kootenai, the West Kootenai country, and had all sorts of people in it, all sorts of diversions. You know, some people were gamblers, and some people, of course, played other games such as baseball. And this is the Moyie baseball team, 1908, Mike, champions of the Kootenays. And this meant probably that they were amongst the best teams in Canada, because certainly the Kootenai teams had very, very fine baseball teams, and the Kootenays also had extremely fine not basketball teams, but hockey teams. And so Phoenix had the hockey teams, and the Boundary Country had the hockey teams, and Rossland and so on. And they also had baseball teams, and the mines would actually pay extra money to have a fine athlete work for their particular mine so he could represent them either in baseball or in hockey.
And he didn't necessarily get the toughest jobs there. I mean, this was to carry the...
No, he wouldn't be a mucker. He would be put in a very, very safe place where he probably wouldn't be killed in a cave-in.
And there's so many different names. There's names on the back of that baseball photograph, and
Sure.
it shows that there's all nationalities
Yep.
and all work together in this kind of
Sure.
thing.
There were English, Irish, French, German, and all different nationalities. It was a kind of a polyglot sort of team, and that was typical.
I've got a postcard here, and whenever you get a postcard, especially from the community that you're talking about,
Yeah.
it gives you an inkling as to the society. This is to Mr. Cowan from Bob and Lola S. It looks like such a beautiful morning. I hope you live to see many more such birthdays. And on the front of this card, of course, is the town we're talking about, Moyie.
That's right.
And this is a colorated card from that era.
Yeah, about 1909, 1910. And but I have several hundred postcards of the old mining towns and collected them over a 30-year span. And this is typical of some of the finer postcards out of that era. And most of them took pride in their town, so they pictured the town on the front of the postcard.
Now, this card, because it shows some of the mines on it at the front, leads us to a demonstration you've got here. This is a really remarkable kit. I guess this could be only considered to be a kit, eh?
Yeah, it's really quite unique. It's kind of a one-man smelter, Mike, is what it is. And they would take the Galena ore or whatever other ore they had here. They would crush it up.
Put it in there.
That's right. Crush it up with the pestle itself, which you're holding in your hand.
This is cast iron too. This
yeah.
This would be the job I'd get, backpacking this thing
Yeah,
into
sure.
That's about weighs a ton.
So you'd
crush it up in
in
there.
there. You'd pour the metal in there.
You take this stuff that's in here,
Yeah.
just dump that into there like
That's
that.
right. And then you'd put that back in there, and then you'd fire it up.
See,
and there'd be gas coming through there, and of course that little shield would keep the actual flame on the pot itself, and you would end up with a button of ore.
A button just in the bottom of this thing. It would melt down whatever was good.
That's right.
And you'd say, by gar, I think we've got ourselves a wealthy
you
one.
bet, you bet. And it was it was an easy way to find out, awkward, but easy way to find out whether we're on good ground.
That is just superb. That whole kit there is a wonderful thing to have.
Yeah, it is.
And this is an actual, burlap sack. What is it used for?
Well, that's actually an original mining sack, and that would be used for carrying out the ore, and they weighed about 60 or 80 pounds, depending upon the ore, how rich the ore was, sometimes 100 pounds, and they would be sometimes rawhided out, sometimes not, and they would come down, they would take out 8 or 10 sacks at a time, depending how they were taking the sacks out.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'd bring them right down to a smelter, and in this case, the concentrator in Old Moyie itself.
And we got a shot of that. As a matter of fact, shows the railway going right by the front of it. Yeah. That concentrator, was it as big as the smelters in Trail, or
no.
what was the?
No, it wasn't. It was just a concentrator, and you can see the tailings out in front on the right-hand side, and you can see the CPR train coming in, and there were ore cars on that actual train itself, and there are some of the mine buildings, and of course the concentrator in the mill is working, and this was when the St. Eugene was pouring out several 100,000 tons had already poured out several 100,000 tons of extremely high-grade ore.
You know how we can put a figure on the success or the riches of a mine? Has anybody been able to do that with the St. Eugene? Was it?
Well, the St. Eugene produced over 1 million tons of extremely high-grade ore, and that's a very heavy production. Now, it pales in comparison to the Sullivan, but the Sullivan has been going for almost 100 years.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, you really can't compare the Sullivan to anything. You know, there's no other silver mine in the world that touches the Sullivan. But the St. Eugene, as far as riches was concerned, as far as ounces per ton, was spectacularly rich.
And it's so easy to overlook these, and I guess that's one of the joys of this program, is that we take a look at all the things that have been ignored around the edges sometimes.
Well, sure, and then you take a look at what happened to the towns. And, you know, all these towns were dependent on the life of the town was locked in with the life of the mine. And so when the St. Eugene began to slide in value and slide in production, Moyie began to slide in value. And, of course, what happened was that the same old thing occurred, as has occurred in many other towns in British Columbia. They began to be a shadow town. And it never became a complete ghost town like Phoenix and Cascade City and Sandon and all these other towns, but it did slip significantly.
Take a break here. Be back in just a second, because as is the case with so many of these locations, there are even stories around the edges of the stories around the edges, and we're going to talk about some of those right after we come back from this break. Trails and Ghost Towns, Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, and as you pointed out, a shadow town is about all that remained of Moyie after a while, but you still find stuff even when you go back there now.
Yeah, there are a couple of hundred people in Moyie, and there are some interesting parts of the town. I think one of the most interesting buildings is the original fire hall, and there's the bell tower and the fire hall itself. I took this picture in 1970.
Does that date from the 1890s?
I think that's 1898, but I'm not dead sure of that, Mike. I believe it's 1898, and the interesting thing about this was, I decided to look around, and I opened the door, and there I saw the original hose reel still there with the buckets, and the buckets were slowly disappearing. And so I thought, oh, and all the helmets had disappeared. So I took the buckets across the street to the restaurant owner, who was a longtime resident of Moyie, and said, look, you better keep all these buckets in the restaurant, because they're going to disappear one by one, too. And so he did. He went over and gathered the rest of the buckets, put them in the restaurant, and they're still preserved, because the helmets, you know, which had the old British lion on it, and they had all disappeared, and that was rather sad.
That is. Well, of course, I'm amazed that they were still around by 1970.
Well,
those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Well, of course, that was the great era of the collecting, right about there, wasn't it?
Yeah.
From the 60s and 70s.
Generally, and then of course at that time too, you see, a lot of Americans from south of the line came into Moyie, and there was a huge dump in Moyie.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, a magnificent dump, and they took out truckload after truckload of bottles, and bottles like this. This is a Kildare bottle, and you can see the actual printing on the side here, Mike, as you examine it, and that's an embossed bottle. And so they had a certain value then, and of course some of them were extremely valuable. And it was rather sad because they went across the line and they should have stayed in Canada.
How many bottles did you say they took?
Well, I know that there were 3 full, huge truckloads out, so that would probably be 500 or 1,000 bottles to a truckload. So there would be probably close to 2,000 or 3,000 bottles from that one collector alone.
Staggering, right?
Yeah.
that was not the end to mining in the country. Just because the St. Eugene went down or went into decline, they had a couple of other, and one really quite interesting one.
Yeah, this is the submarine mine, and here you are looking from the submarine mine, which is under the waters of Moyie Lake, looking right back into Moyie town itself. And this is an early shot, actually, but this is, people were searching all through the area, and there you see Moyie with all the hotels, 3 or 4 hotels, and you see the business district, and so they searched all through this area, and sometimes they came up with a mine, and sometimes they came up with something a little different.
Yeah, a little different.
Yeah.
What is that? What do you?
Well, you know, there's a little town just south of Moyie, and it's called Yak, which is an unusual town. It's an old railroad town.
Yak.
It has a couple of hotels in it, and you know, people are always looking around these old towns, and there have been several treasures out of Yak, strangely. We'll talk about one of them today, and it's a small town. It's only about a little over 100 people in Yak, and in 1969, or in the spring of 1970, I can't remember which, these are the number, about 700 silver coins came out of Yak, out of a hiding place in Yak, and it's debatable whether they came from a dump or came from behind a false wall in what they call the New Hotel. I'm inclined to think they came out from behind a false wall in the New Hotel. They were picked up by a guy called Al Watts. He got them from the original guy who found them, and they were all Canadian silver dollars, silver coins, and so on, dating from about 1936 back. So they'd probably lain in the original place, hiding place, until finally they were found by this individual, brought into Al Watts, and I have some of those in my collection. I got them off Al Watts.
I would assume that this is how so many of the ghost towns disappeared. I mean, the story that there was a treasure in a false wall at a hotel would lead anyone who went into any hotels that they found to remove walls hand over fist to try and find out if there was a treasure in this new one.
Well, they didn't there. I imagine they sounded it. I imagine they went over with detectives. But the other story, very briefly, so we're coming to the end of the program, is that another guy was digging a post hole in Yak, very close to this other find. And he dug down the post hole, hit a pot, and in the pot, uncovered, the pot didn't even have a lid on it. There was some dirt in the pot, of course, but he removed the dirt off the top of the pot, and it was full of gold and silver coins. And this was approximately the same time, just slightly before the so-called Yak find.
Why would they gravitate to Yak? I mean, what was it? Was it a way house on the way to or from one of these places?
If my memory serves me correctly, there was no bank in Yak. So if there's no bank in Yak, an individual is inclined to bank for himself. He doesn't like to carry that cash, and so therefore he counts a certain number of fence posts out in the area, and that's where the third fence pole off to the right of the main entrance to the ranch.
Now we've stimulated a whole other sort of historical research. Towns that didn't have banks that may yield treasures in pots in post hold areas.
Oh yeah, all sorts of under flagstones in post holes and so on, Mike.
Remarkable story. Father Cocola?
Father Cocola.
Cocola, and how he stimulated the discovery of silver at the St. Eugene Mine, giving birth to the town of Moyie, and that's been our story today on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We invite you to join us again next week as we take a look at yet another great story from British Columbia's past. Join us then for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Bye-bye.